Welcome. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce this conversation. This is something I've been excited about since we entered into this agreement to do this today with Professor Martha Bayles of Boston College, contributing editor to American Purpose, and with Brandon Terry, who is a political scientist, PhD from Yale, currently assistant professor for African American Studies and Social Studies at Harvard, and an important and prolific writer about Black studies, the history of the civil rights movement in the United States. I think many will know his work, and Martha's too, in these areas, plural. It's an hour conversation. Martha's going to lead us off and manage this discussion with Professor Terry. So Brandon Terry, thank you in advance. Martha Bayles, tip of hat in advance. Over to you. We're looking forward.
Okay. Welcome to everyone. I understand this is not live, so I'm giving you my welcome in advance. I would like very much to thank, I'm going to call you Brandon, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, and you call me Martha. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I came across you fairly recently because I was seeking someone to interview who would be really good about this and not just sort of repeat the bromides that are often repeated in the lead up to the Martin Luther King holiday. And so I asked someone I respect hugely, Professor William Julius Wilson, who is emeritus at Harvard University, who is one of the wisest heads on the planet when it comes to Black America, white America, and what's been going on in our country really for the 20th century. He's just one of the most even-handed, fair-minded people I know on any topic. And he recommended you, Brandon. So I'm really delighted to make your acquaintance, and I've been reading your stuff. And I'm admiring of your even-handedness and your open-mindedness as well. So on that note, I'd like to, I guess you've written a lot about King, but you've written about a lot of other figures, and you're currently working on another work on the civil rights movement, which I won't plug because I don't have enough of an idea of it yet, but it sounds really interesting. Let me begin with some of the observations that you've made in your work about Martin Luther King. And I guess, would it be fair, how would you characterize your approach? Because I know he's become, it might surprise some of our viewers that he's become a rather controversial figure in academia and in the discourse of Black intellectuals and activists and others.
Right.
How would you characterize your, where you're coming from in that? I'm not trying to ask you for a political label or anything like that, but how would you characterize your approach overall?
No, that's a great question. And so first, let me thank you for doing this and thank you for the invitation. We will forever be in rivalry about who admires William Julius Wilson more, but it's in great company to be in with a fellow admirer, and I'm honored that he would suggest me. It's great to be here with you as well, Jeff, and thank you all to the staff at American Purpose for inviting me. Let me lay out, I think, where my intervention is coming from with the study of Dr. King. So the very first thing that I think is unique is that I really treat Dr. King as a public philosopher. So many of us approach Dr. King as a remarkable, heroic figure. He was, as a brilliant strategist and tactician in many respects was. But very few people have grappled with the significance of his intellectual and philosophical contributions that he wrote in collaboration with others, 5 major books, countless really serious speeches and essays. And that spending any time with him as a thinker, with those words that he produced in the course of argument, it really puts you in a different mind state to where we are right now. Because what you see is somebody who's trying to make a persuasive case, not only to the people he's trying to organize. And remember, he's asking people to risk their lives. This is not a cost-free enterprise. He's not asking for likes on Twitter. He's asking you to risk dying for the principles that he's laying out. So he has to give real arguments, right? And he takes this deathly seriously. When they're on the cusp of the Birmingham Children's Campaign, he can't get out of bed that day because he's so crippled with terror and guilt and anxiety about the idea of enlisting children to fight in this struggle, right? You talk about depression, anxiety, he's got it, right?
And was that before the bombing of the church?
Yes.
So, yeah, he was also prescient.
Prescient, right? And so not only is he making this case to a real persuasive case to his potential followers, his potential comrades in struggle, but he's also trying to make a case to his opponents, right? He treats the arguments of the figures in the Black Power movement, the figures in the counterculture, the figures on the more radical left, conservatives. He's trying to make arguments to them as well, to persuade them of the wisdom of his position, to point out weaknesses in their position, and that's just a level of intensity of argument and openness and receptivity that I think we have lost some of our capability for. So that's the first thing, is just like really trying to take him seriously as a political philosopher with lots to say about questions of economic justice, civil disobedience, militarism, the nature of ethical virtues in political life, and so forth. Now, two other things I really try to push back on. One has become really quite familiar, and it's the idea that his canonization has come at a cost, that in turning King into a figure of national consensus and ceremonial celebration, we've flattened a lot of what's incisive and interesting about his work. And the fact that he's so easily claimed by figures from a wide range of political traditions, including, I mean, in my research, I found white supremacists who say, well, we're just like Martin Luther King because we're fighting for an oppressed racial minority, and we don't disparage him. We actually learn a lot from him. Now, we could think of that as cynical, but it does reflect their sense of the broader political culture, that this is a person that everyone's got to be in favor of. Or else you're not admissible in the public arena. Well, that comes at a real cost. We don't understand that his views on economic justice are quite challenging and really at odds with where a lot of the country is. His views about what's permissible in the arena of dissent are really challenging to figures across all sides. So that's the second piece. And the last piece is, as you laid out, there are many, I think, in the Black intellectual arena on the left who now see King as a kind of convenient target of criticism for his charismatic leadership is a thing that you often hear criticized, and he's the sort of figure that people are imagining when they talk about that. People pointing out his sexism, which is true. I mean, he is a sexist figure, and I've criticized him at great length about those questions. But also they think he's embroiled in an objectionable politics of respectability, that ultimately he seems too enamored with the mores and performance of middle-class bourgeois American life at the mid 20th century, and that we thankfully have surpassed that sense of moral comportment to discover a more freeing set of values by which people could live their lives. And I just think that's a profound misreading of what King is up to. The reason why he talks about the things that he talks about, it's a profound misreading of his analysis of Black disadvantage. And it's been my goal to get people to see those richer elements of his thought and not mirror the rejection, not mirror the canonization of him by the mainstream by a kind of wholesale rejection as if he's a convenient figure of bourgeois accommodation or something like that. I think we've lost mute.
Sorry. You are in that very strange no man's land that we call the lost middle or the disappearing center or something like that. I'm not trying to characterize you politically. I'm trying to characterize your sort of multivalent direction of your sort of defense of King, but you also accept certain elements of the critique.
Absolutely.
We talked about various points about this leading up to this. So let me sort of take the first one and ask you to address it. I took some notes from what you said, and if I mischaracterized your views, you could correct me. That King, in your way of looking at him, offers a third way to shape identity. I think that's kind of how you put it. And also allied with that is this idea, I like this phrase that you used. I'm not sure I'm using it correctly in this context, but monocausal anti-blackness as a monocause, as sort of the sole cause of everything that's wrong, that everything that goes wrong for African Americans and in American society, perhaps more broadly, that anti-Black racism is this kind of pervasive force that sort of is behind everything. Now, this is not a view that I embrace, so I'll be clear about that. But I'm curious what you were getting at, because we didn't talk about it at length, and hoping that we could perhaps explore it a bit now.
Sure. Well, I think King is trying to push us to do two things. And you'll often hear me say Black disadvantage instead of racial inequality, in part because I'm trying to be, in following King, extremely specific. Not all inequalities are questions of justice. Some may reflect totally reasonable judgments or decisions that different groups make, different values. But some are objectionable and some are evidence of great and profound injustice. And the question is, how do you disentangle them? And so one of the things I think he does really, really well is that he lays out that we shouldn't retreat to the idea of racism as the sole mover of the complicated terrain of disadvantage that many Black people and Black communities are mired in. We need to understand that there is a profound legacy of racial injustice that has not been remediated, right? We're not far off. My father was educated in Jim Crow schools, right? That's not that long ago. That has consequences that we have not dealt with. There are consequences about segregation in housing, explicit discrimination, that even in the absence of active discrimination at present would produce unfair and unjust outcomes if not remediated. So he is upfront that does exist. He's upfront that there's active discrimination that exists. And we know this in real estate markets, transactions. One of the things he did in Chicago in 1966 is he actually helped pioneer testing. So they would go into apartment brokers as send Black tenants into apartment brokers and ask if they have any available housing in white neighborhoods. They would inevitably be told no. Then they would send white staffers in, and those staffers would be shown a plethora of housing. That testing model has now become basically the basis for anti-discrimination work in housing law. So he is serious about racism, and he thinks we got to be philosophically astute about what exactly racism consists of, and we can talk about that. But he also wants to make clear a really, really, really important thing, which is that there are broader economic changes and dislocations that cannot be reduced to racial animus, racial ideology, and that just because of the location of African Americans when these shifts happen, they're going to bear the brunt of the negative consequences of many of these changes without some sort of concerted, visionary, strategic intervention to do otherwise. So when you have automation, the robotics revolution, the digital revolution in the late 20th century in the United States, the people it's clearing out of the labor market are the people who have just been released from the strictures of Jim Crow America. They're undereducated, they're without much material wealth at their disposal to invest in education, which now you all of a sudden need much more of. They're without a lot of experience with educational institutions to help their children navigate them well, and bureaucracies. So these are things that actually King thinks you can build allies around, because Black people are going to be the most extremely affected, but they're not the only ones affected.
Right. And I think you pointed out in an article you wrote for the Boston Review and probably elsewhere, and I was really struck by some of the things you quote King having written and said. He was extraordinarily prescient about the disappearance of certain kinds of employment through automation. I don't know if he talked about the export of jobs overseas at that, in the mid 60s. But this is, of course, another theme that Professor Wilson has pursued at great length. It's the sort of the double whammy of economic changes and a legacy of various kinds of deprivation, but also social dysfunction. This is something that Professor Wilson is not afraid to talk about, and he's no conservative, but he talks about the various factors. It's not just one thing or the other. So I think that's very interesting, and I'm impressed by how King kind of saw that. Tell us why, we could go back to the early 60s and of course King's meteoric rise as the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and all that, but I'm actually interested in asking you about King after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, when he decided he had to go north. And he went to Chicago, most famously, to address the housing segregation that you've mentioned. And we both have read the historian Christopher Lasch and others who see that King somehow, he waded into waters that were too deep for him at that point, or he just was overwhelmed by the situation of these, what Wilson would call the truly disadvantaged, the inner city population of Black Americans who really were the worst off. And that's the portrait of it that I've gotten from other historians. And I know you're not a historian, although you seem to be partly a historian. What about that? When he got to Chicago, what did he do right? Or what did his supporters do right? What did they do wrong? Why does that phase of his career have a kind of tragic air to it, or an air of failure to it? Because I think it does, and I think that's been passed down as part of the way people understand King.
Right. Okay. So there are lots of threads here. So let me back up one place. So I think it's conventional to tell the story of the civil rights movement as, and King is partly guilty of this framing. So he and Bayard Rustin in part cook up this framing that there's the classical phase of the civil rights movement that ends with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And now we must move, in Bayard Rustin's famous commentary essay, from protest to politics. And we've got to move from the civil rights movement to a new social movement that's going to be a left labor civil rights alliance. And it's going to be the refoundation of the Democratic Party. And we're going to pursue this massive egalitarian agenda through real, quote unquote, politics. We're no longer fighting against discrimination, humiliation, brutality. This was always a mischaracterization of what's happening. So King, remember, went to school in the North. He's visiting the North regularly. The largest civil rights demonstration that he addresses before before the March on Washington, is in Chicago, right? So the largest civil rights campaigns, the ones that have the highest degree of participation, are happening around schooling in New York, housing and schooling in Chicago. In '64, he's in Boston, organizing against the slum. So they're doing some of this work. It's just that in Chicago, that's where they decide to make their stand. And in part, they choose Chicago because they've been so successful there. They feel like they have a constituency. They feel like they've made progress.
What sort of, excuse me for interrupting you,
Sure.
question. What sort of success have they had other than marches, or is that the definition of the success?
Well, they've been able to organize around schools relatively effectively, and they seem to have a constituency, which they think at that time includes the Daley administration. They seem to think they have a constituency that will be amenable to the kinds of work they want to do in terms of housing integration, slum abolition, increasing opportunities for schooling of ghetto youth, organizing among the growing street gangs in Chicago to redirect people's energies and organizational genius toward more productive and socially contributory ends. So there's just a lot of enthusiasm at this moment to do that. And what they run headlong into are a couple of problems. One is that they get outmaneuvered by the style of politics in the North, right? So one of the reasons King is such a remarkable figure is Jim Crow. You don't have a Black elected officials in the South. He's not competing with a vibrant Black public sphere in the press. That space has been cleared out for ministers, mostly to bad effect in Jim Crow, but it allowed for the emergence of someone like King. He's no longer the only mover in Chicago. And he's getting, they're not quite sure how to navigate against the Daley machine, against the churches there, against the other kinds of institutions, against the elected officials. So that's one problem. Second problem is that the kind of organizing they were trying to do, they were doing tenants unions, they were doing gang organizing to try to get a really remarkable project to like really rethink the foundations of how we do the housing market, right? Who gets to contribute and decide how housing is provided, how housing is maintained, what that market looks like. Will that be susceptible to democratic decision-making and decision procedures? They're trying to upend all of that, but that's such a long-term project that their organizing model has traditionally revolved around big, spectacular media events. And when they didn't have those things, and when they were grinding along with like hard work of community organizing, some of his staff got frustrated and decided to turn toward open housing marches, which then produced the violence, the white backlash that we now know they sort of, the Chicago campaign is famous for. And the disruption and terror that unleashed was so devastating that it basically shut down the movement. And not in a way that the Bull Connor stuff worked in Birmingham, because these people were able to produce a different narrative and one that was more resilient to King's competing charge that this is all motivated by a kind of deep anti-Blackness by the elites of the Chicago area. These were working class white people who had other kinds of claims to make against white Chicago elites. So it just was a much messier terrain that he found himself in. And it led to a lot of despair because he couldn't quite figure out a way out by 66, 67, 68.
And so there was a kind of resistance among particularly those working class whites who held the marches in their neighborhoods. That was a famous, that was, I get, you're saying that was different in quality and impact than the white resistance that was so telegenic in the South and that raised a lot of support in the rest of the country. This did not have that effect.
No.
Partly because of the timing and partly because of other things. Maybe perhaps more people in the country identified with those neighborhoods than they did with the white Southerners. You probably have a better explanation than I do. But what about What about the Black constituents in Chicago? Um, one of the criticisms of the civil rights movement that you discuss is that it was actually based in, if you look at the people in the Dexter Street Church or the Ebenezer Baptist Church, these were, relatively successful, striving, church-going, respectable people. And I use the word respectable in a positive sense, not a negative sense. But they were people who already had a certain solidarity in their community, did they not? Based in the churches. And they were the people who were kind of most active. Now you can correct me if I'm wrong, certainly in the early days. And then a lot of other people obviously got involved. But in the North, was there that kind of a core of people who were sort of ready to participate? Or were the Black communities of Chicago more disorganized, more troubled perhaps, or more, I don't know. Tell me if there was a difference or if this is a misperception on my part.
Yeah, you have the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, 56. And then it's really hard going for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference for years. Mm-hmm. They can't get another campaign of equally significant mobilization or effectiveness. And what really catalyzes what we all talk about as the civil rights movement, the classical phase of the civil rights movement, are when the Southern students start to engage in the sit-ins and the freedom rides. And these students, they are students, so they're part of a kind of middle class, Black educated constituency, but they are at odds with certain norms about respectability in many respects. These are not the most conventional bourgeois strivers amongst the Black community. Those are the people being told to stay home by their parents because this is too dangerous. This is when I was growing up, I would ask my mother, like, oh, did you do any of the civil rights stuff? My mother said, no. My grandmother said, your grandmother said we had to stay in the house. This was scary. This was frightening. This was dangerous. So what I think is the difficulty is that when they're trying to organize people in Chicago, they are organizing people who are less attached to existing institutions. So I think that's true. The institutions in the ghetto have already been weakened pretty significantly, and they're being weakened dramatically by their own victory. So integration also weakens the institutions in these communities. And they're organizing on the back end of a lot of victories. So one of their diagnoses of their own situation is that people's expectations have been greatly heightened. People want dramatic victories and they want them quickly. People have greater expectations than they've had in decades, and they want those expectations answered. They no longer believe in the racist lies and ideologies that have been used to justify their conditions to them. And when they're met with resistance and what they think is a really unfair resistance, that starts to make forms of Black power radicalism more palatable to them, or forms of just straightforward nihilism, right? You're starting to see the really public assassinations pick up. You're starting to see the police repression become more organized. And so these things have a really horrific impact on people's hope, and the kinds of infinite hope, as King might put it, that inspire people to make great sacrifices and endure for a long siege, a long struggle. To the extent that people aren't willing to do that, you get the turn against King, because he can't. So much of his project relies on sacrifice. And if you can't justify sacrifice to people, you get what I think you get now, which is that people speak in a really different idiom. They don't speak in the idiom of sacrifice any longer. It's very hard. People say, it's not my job to educate you. It's not my job to change this. It's someone else's job. I don't have any obligation to do that. That's a really impoverished ethical language. It's not King's language, right?
Well,
He's talking about other things like sacrifice and the good and heroism.
which brings us to the other point that I think we only probably have time to explore another point, although there are about 8 others in my list. But what you have to say about King's virtue ethics, maybe that's not the right phrase, but that this issue of whether respectability,
Yeah.
the politics of respectability, which became very quickly a negative term among some of the Black Power activists, because it suggested a bourgeois middle class, assimilationist, and therefore, sort of too much trying to be like the white folks, to put it crudely. And so there are all these strains of radicalism that were certainly in the counterculture in general,
Absolutely.
Among young whites and so forth. All that got mixed up together. And today, even today, we have a kind of antipathy among certain leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, a strong antipathy to the family, to the traditional family, and to traditional gender roles. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that equates to sexism. I think traditional gender roles, this is my view, do not simply reduce to sexism, but that's just my view. So you get this kind of countercultural element, and what was a kind of resistance to a very particular kind of oppression in the South, the segregation laws, has sort of exploded all over the place and become a multifaceted, countercultural, sometimes would-be revolutionary bunch of things, sort of hydra-headed movement where, there's a lot of different things going on, some of them very, very valid and very important, and some of them probably less so. And in the middle of all this, I guess, rather than go back to how King handled all that, which is a fascinating topic for historians, but looking more to the present, what can we take from King's ethics? I mean, I'm making a speech and I want you to talk, but what can we take from King's ethical vision or his moral and philosophical vision that would help to kind of steady some of the craziness now, without it looking like just a reversion to the same old, respectability in a sort of narrow social sense versus respectability, or maybe a better term. You have a sense that the ends and the means need to resemble each other, and that was one of King's central tenets. I'll be quiet and let you talk.
No, this is good. Yeah, so I want to make sure to be clear about where I think a lot of this is coming from. So, my colleague Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham helps pioneer the phrase, the politics of respectability, right? And she's talking about two things. It's a study of Black Baptist women organizing politically at the turn of the 20th century. And she's talking about two things. One is that there's one sort of strategic response to any form of negative group stigma, which is to adopt the most valorized and respectable ideas of comportment and self-description and ethical practices that prevail in your society, so as to undermine the stigma of that faces your group. And this will be true of African Americans, true of LGBTQ communities, true of religious minorities, right? And you can see these arguments all of the time. And critics from the Black Power movement on down have rightly raised certain concerns. One is about, your self-respect. Is it appropriate to think that people's basic rights turn on their comportment with the prevailing mores of a society? They raise important questions about assimilation. So if we treat these standards as immune to criticism, might we lose track of other ways of living that are in fact even more ethically defensible or viable or fascinating, or certainly that we should just keep around because they're interesting and valuable to people and don't hurt anyone. So I think all of those questions are well put, and that's where the Politics of Respectability gets some of its deserved opprobrium. But my concern is when we use the Politics of Respectability in such an expansive way, and this is not how Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham meant it, it's such an expressive way to basically describe almost everything that people are doing in the realm of ethical practice as a response to stigma or discrimination. So we flatten everything into strategy. And we forget that people have views about the good, that they're trying to articulate, as you can see in the King case, metaphysically informed visions of the good. That we have to talk about flourishing. We have to talk about better and worse ways of living. And in fact, the critics of these things do so themselves. And that's what King is trying to articulate, that these things shouldn't be, he's not trying to defend. He's like, I'll give one example I think will help clarify. So when he's got criticisms of rage and hatred, they're not because avoiding rage and hatred makes your arguments more palatable to white people. That's not the reason. That may be true. It may not be true. But what he says is that it changes you. It ruins your sense of what's beautiful, what's true, what's valuable. It turns inward and causes you to destroy your own social ties, right? That hatred is uncontrollable. It seeks every opportunity for its expression to prove its reality to itself. It's corrosive. These are ethical arguments. They're not about strategy. They're about better and worse ways of living. It's like when someone tells you, when you break up with a lover, don't spend all your time obsessing over them with hatred. It ruins your other relationships. There's something to that. And I worry that in the kind of strategic conception of Black thought and the philosophy of protest that has prevailed in the wake of the civil rights movement, that we've lost a whole wing of thinking and are eroding our own capability of having serious ethical disagreement about better and worse ways of living and how they might attach to different practices of politics. So for me, the reason not to humiliate my opponents in politics is not just because I think it's ineffective, although I do think that. It's because I don't want to deny people the capacity for self-transformation that I believe I have. Because if I do that, then I start foreclosing the way other people treat me, right? I get stuck in a box of where I was at one particular moment when I can read and think and change my views and revise my life plans like any rational person. Those to me are arguments that I think we've got to hold on to, and that King gives us one of the best entry points into.
Here again, I would, I keep wanting to sort of point to what to me is the somewhat larger frame and context in which some of these changes have been occurring. We live in a culture that, as I've argued, I've written a lot about popular music.
Yeah, of course.
And there was a certain point in the late 70s when a certain strain of popular music, from heavy metal and all that to punk to all the different varieties of music and, hip hop at a certain point, rap and hip hop, the only acceptable emotion that you could really express freely was anger. And you can analyze why that is, but I think it's obvious that it was the case. And that now angry music of anger and rage, has become almost the kind of orthodoxy of popular music, and across the genres, with exception of country music, but even country music's gotten kind of red, white, and blue angry, So, and when anger is privileged above other emotions, and then along comes the digital age, and you have this frictionless universe of social media where expressing anger is the one that gets the most clicks, and expressing anger is the one that keeps people on their devices and on their platforms longest, then you have this sort of toxic brew. And so I really think of, I'm not going to single out one of your themes and say it's the most important, but I will say that that theme is really important to me because of the way that I look at things and the way I look at the overall culture. And I'm curious, do you or any of the scholars that you're in conversation with, do they take that part into consideration, the music, the culture of African Americans and white folks, but really the African American piece, which to me was the thing that drew me to learn more about the world of Black people. I certainly didn't grow up in a world where I knew any Black people, but I was drawn into that world by the attraction of the culture and the music, not because I felt sorry for people or because I had a political agenda, but because I was attracted to something in the way of expression that was not part of my schooling and that meant a lot to me. And I ended up writing a book about it, and I'm still very interested in it. And I have sometimes a problem with, the social and political discourse, that it doesn't seem to pay any attention to that.
Yeah.
But it's so central. So this is a wild question out of the blue, but
No. It's an
curious what you
important
would have to
question.
say.
It's an important question. I mean, I've written a piece, reflection on Cornel West's political philosophy, and Cornel is somebody who's deeply, he always talks about popular culture and expressive culture. And I think one of the things that led him to his diagnosis of the problem of nihilism in the early 1990s was his sense of a change in the tenor of popular musical expression. That songs about the ghetto, just to take one kind of narrow range, went from sort of elegiac blues lamentations like Marvin Gaye's The Ecology, Mercy, Mercy Me, Across 110th Street. They went from songs like that to the kind of things you see. I think that the kind of greatest work in this vein is Notorious B.I.G.'s Ready to Die. And if you really sit with something like Ready to Die, it's a remarkable text because the album is really about losing what Nietzsche would call life affirmation. He commits suicide at the end of the album. And you really think about like Black art, the number of depictions of suicide, just very, very small. It's not a thing for a young 23-year-old Black man to produce a work of art where at the end, he kills himself. So I think there are a lot of readings of gangster rap where it's like, it's all about bravado and triumphant defeat of all your enemies on the street and violations of white propriety. It's like, this guy kills himself at the end. He's so despairing. He says his mom doesn't love him. His girlfriend doesn't love him. He can't take care of his kids. The things that he's doing don't bring him any joy or pleasure. He finds no meaning in his craft. It's just a thing that he does. And he kills himself at the end. And that reflects, I think, a larger sense of despair and disorientation that has unraveled our political culture. And here I evoke the late Lonnie Guinier, who just passed away. She's absolutely brilliant. And she wrote that amazing book with Gerald Torres called The Miner's Canary. And to me, what King, they were writing in a kind of Kingian mode, which is one of the things that racism can trick you into doing is trying to make things the exclusive property of one group. And that these things that people identified as ghetto pathologies or Black pathologies of the 1960s, they were miners' canaries. These are things that are now part and parcel of the broader society. If you look at white family structure, it looks like what Daniel Patrick Moynihan was writing in the 1960s. If you look at, people thought about the coarsening of the music, you're seeing the coarsening of the music and the culture everywhere. And these things reflect what? They reflect economic insecurity, cultural anxiety, the eclipse of hope, the degradation of institutional life and associational life where people can come together and have civil discourse and get to know each other and have outlets for joy and fraternity that don't turn on a priori identities already being cemented. When those things are gone, this is what you get in a society like ours, a society that is always going to have a enormously rapacious and innovative and insinuating consumer culture that's trying to sell by any means.
Yeah.
That's what takes the space of these other forms of ethical formation if we don't have a well-defined view, if we don't have rituals and structures and practices that create a kind of cultural armor against that. So I think there is something there. And I think any analysis, I mean, one of the things I say in the King essay is that part of why people don't feel at odds with Martin Luther King is he doesn't seem cool. Because we're on the other side of the sexual revolution. We're on the other side of a certain kind of street affect. He's too earnest. He's too staid. He's too repressed, it seems like. But he's trying to get at something that we shouldn't throw out with the bathwater. He's trying to get at the question of character. And I've got to reject axiomatically any view that equates virtues, so things that I think are true excellences of character, with white people as such. That's absurd to me. And any view that says that we don't need to talk about excellences of character because we have a language of resistance and accommodation. That's not an adequate enough ethical vocabulary to describe the decisions people actually have to make, even in the consequence of severe unfairness, in condition of severe unfairness.
And if I can push whatever envelope we're pushing here, I can push it a little bit more and say that the phenomena you're describing are now, of course, extremely visible on that part of the right that has been taken over by a similar kind of ethic of resistance and anger and hating your enemies and doing anything to defeat your enemies. Our polity now, we have two sides, both of whom are trying to burn the house down and blame the other one for arson, it seems to me. So some of these dynamics, all of these dynamics move freely back and forth across the racial divide. And I think they always have. And if we could see that, perhaps we'd have a better handle on both those forces and on the nature of what really is the racial divide. What does it really consist of?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, I think there's the thing I do try to hold tight and fast to is that I think the Black Power movement is complicated. It has a lot of people in it who are extremely smart analysts of what's happening to the socioeconomic fabric at the time. They're trying to make really important points about political economy, militarism, and it's an era that I think is woefully understudied in social and political thought. But it does have currents that are nihilistic. And those currents are the ones that are most likely to get picked up by popular culture. And unfortunately, they're the currents that I think can surreptitiously slide into people's forms of life without them really reflexively adopting it. I think thinking a lot about nationalism, Black and otherwise, has given me a lot of insight to what's going on the right. And I think the thing that has always scared me most about it is that there's a kind of leadership people gravitate toward when they are nihilistic and they feel like nothing they're going to do is really going to fundamentally change what's wrong, but they want to engage in a practice of counter-humiliation and express their most extreme forms of resentment. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, if we talk about policies, if we talk about how we're going to materially make people's lives better, it doesn't matter if people don't believe you. It doesn't matter if those hopes don't feel real to them. They're going to constantly go with the people who give voice to their desire for a kind of contempt to be expressed, because that's real. We know that can be delivered. These other things may seem like pie in the sky.
Yeah.
right? Marxists on the left are always, they're always sad that they can't organize working class Black people that well. And it's partly because people don't have a lot of faith in the project, that you're going to win the things you say you're going to win, that the costs are going to be too high. And so when somebody else can slip in and say, well, I'm not actually going to, Black nationalist figures like Louis Farrakhan or something like that, when they say, we know he's not going to deliver anything particularly effective, but he's going to express things that people feel. And he's going to engage in a kind of counter humiliation that people can take pleasure in. And that's going to push other things out of the arena. I think you're seeing something similar on the right. And I don't quite know how to combat it. But one thing I do know, and the thing that keeps me coming back to King, is that there is a kind of authenticity that King is trying to manifest that seems to me to be a significant bulwark against cynicism and nihilism. The idea that you risk your life, not just for the people who are already on your side, but for your ostensible enemies, that scrambles things. What he called a moral jujitsu. It takes the force of the enemy and redirects it in a direction that no one's anticipated. I don't know that that's right, but it does seem to me to be a really challenging kind of political, ethical vision for our moment, because it's so foreign.
Yeah, and this is the topic we really neglected, which was the true nature of nonviolent resistance as understood by King, which was not just passivity or pacifism,
No, absolutely not.
But a kind of firm and solid and well-calculated thrust against that which was oppressing people.
And non-cooperation with evil.
And in our next Zoom conference, we can talk about how do you make that work now in the age of digital surveillance and all these things that we're talking about. But I'm afraid we may be running out of time. I think it's 12:06, and I don't know what the cutoff point is. Do we have a little more time?
We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Well, I will maybe ask you to comment on that if you have a comment ready, and then we'll say goodbye for now.
Absolutely. So yes, I think it's really unfortunate that in the wake of the civil rights movement, much of what nonviolence as a form of political philosophy and political strategy got reduced to was tactical decisions. So, a lot of people basically debate nonviolence in the domain of efficacy. If we can imagine we have a set of goals and the goals are to pass the Civil Rights Act, is it more likely or less likely? If the goal is to close the Black wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, is it more likely or less likely to come from this? To me, that's the wrong way of framing it. The built into nonviolence is a set of ethical goals and a set of what my teacher and friend Karuna Mantana at Columbia will describe as a kind of realism. Right. So often nonviolence is caricatured as Pollyannish or utopian, but actually it's the most realist view of politics, because it's trying to diagnose where is this coming from? Where is the hostility, the resentment, the distrust coming from? One of the things I argue in the piece, getting from King, my piece MLK Now, is that racist ideology is obsessed. If you look at like real white supremacist discourse, it's obsessed with the fantasy or the fear of revenge. From Reconstruction to slave revolts to Black Power to Obama, the idea is that once Black people get power, they're going to do something nefarious to us, just like what was done to them. Now, they may dissemble about what was done to them, but the fear of retaliation and vengeance and revenge, it's all there, right? You've got Glenn Beck at the chalkboard saying, well, the Affordable Care Act is really a nefarious plan for Black reparations, for Obama and his anti-colonial impulses to get revenge. It sounds very silly to someone like me, but I try to diagnose, where does that come from? People's fears come from somewhere. And to me, it's rooted in a vision of the world as demarcated into really strict and tightly defined groups that struggle over zero-sum resources. That's one of the bedrock foundations of a racist vision. If you think like that, then that's how you end up in this kind of terrain. So what does nonviolence do? Nonviolence helps diffuse the idea that there is a zero-sum competition at work, that someone must be eliminated in order for my group to flourish.
By not taking the same view.
By not taking the same view and dramatically tethering the fact that you resist that view to these like performative actions that make it really hard to deny that these people are coming from somewhere really different, right? That's a realist contribution. There's another part of nonviolence I think is really important, where it's about trying to take seriously the idea that politics is about force. It involves coercion. It involves struggle. But there are ways in which you can perform those feats without producing intractable resentment forever, right? And one of the problems with violence, King says and Gandhi says, is that it creates a retaliatory ethos, in part because it's almost impossible to constrain violence to where you imagine it to go strategically. Right. Like it's always going to overflow the boundaries of what you meant it to do. And when it does that, you have to exceed your original justification. So you're constantly backsliding on the justifications. And then the people who retaliate are constantly backsliding on the justifications. And you create what King described as a kind of perpetual winter bitterness, right? Nonviolence helps contain some of that because it allows people a chance to redescribe themselves, to refound a polity without a mythos of revolutionary insurrection and violence. It allowed, and you see this in our polity. I mean, no one describes themselves, even if they are in fact these people, no one describes themselves as the ideological descendant of Bull Connor. We've allowed ourselves to be refounded and re-narrate our ancestors so that Martin Luther King belongs to all. Now, that's not exactly accurate, but you can see why that's a more hopeful form of politics than ones that are simply about extinguishing the enemy. So there's something really powerful there. And I think that I implore, you have lots of academic folks in the audience, and I know lots of teachers and others that are doing this work in churches and civic spaces. It's just like, this is a real political tradition. And when you're teaching about the different modes of politics, I implore people to really take seriously nonviolence as a tradition, as a profound set of philosophical contributions to how we might think about the world. Because even if you don't go the whole way, I think it will really, nothing to me ever in my political education has been more unsettling than reading Gandhi. Nothing. And I think it's because it really does challenge you at the basis of means and ends, and how that frames most of our political thinking.
That is a note that I'd love to continue on, but it's also a good note to end on. And so I'm just going to thank you, Brandon. This has been really very, very rich conversation for me. And I'll give the last word to our host, Jeff. And I just can't thank you enough. I really
thank you so much, Martha. I really enjoyed the conversation.
So I'll take that word back to me, Martha. Wow, you too. Martha, what a wonderful job in managing and leading this conversation. And to you, Brandon, as guest of honor and driving things. I know you're a scholar, you're an author, and you're an educator, but let me tell you that when that day comes that you decide to run for public office, I will be in the long line, ready to volunteer. This has just been so impressive and rich and stimulating and challenging. By the way, you started and then you took us on the journey and you ended with Dr. King as philosopher. And so this for me has been a wonderful conversation about Black history, about American history, and about the health of our democracy. Wow, what an hour, you two. Professor Terry, thanks. Professor Bayles, thank you. And to those who are able to listen and watch, have a good weekend, stay safe, and celebrate the holiday honoring Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you all.
Thank you.